with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. God, maker of all marvels, you weave the planet and all its creatures together in kinship. Your unifying love is revealed in the interdependence of relationships in the complex world that you have made. Save us from the illusion that humankind is separate and alone, and join us in communion with all inhabitants of the universe. Through Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, who topples the dividing walls by the power of your Holy Spirit, and who lives and reigns with you forever and ever. Amen. Turn it over to Ragan. Ragan.
Thank you, Joshua, for that wonderful prayer that fits in so well with a lot of what I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about today. So, we've come this far in talking about the place and what a human being is, the vocation of the human being, and some of the ways that we might learn from the Christian tradition on humility, on how to fully embrace what being a human in this world is when we live into the fullness of our flourishing and our vocation. And so today I want to get into some practices that might further help us to live into this. And along with these, maybe practices is too specific a term, maybe kind of modes of living that could be helpful. And I'm also going to point out with those maybe some more specific, concrete things that you might try on in your life to see if it helps. Because I'm a big believer that we are called into a life that is a gift, and that all of the grace and mercy that we receive is a gift, but there are ways that we can prepare ourselves to fully receive those gifts. And so I think that humility is no different in that regard. So I'm going to start, first of all, we've been going along and kind of giving some fuzzy definitions of humility, and that's intentional because I think there's a lot of baggage to unpack in our conception of humility. But I want to offer a couple of definitions that I think will be helpful for us to get into for our conversation today. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I've got some slides, and so hopefully this will work a little bit better than trying to share different image files. Presenting on Zoom is this whole nother thing, so we'll see how this works. But I'm gonna share my screen and hopefully be able to get this into the big slideshow mode. So let's see. Okay, everyone see that? Is this great?
Yeah, we sure can.
All right. So bit of a backstory, but when Joshua and I overlapped in seminary, we had a little philosophy reading group, and we studied Iris Murdoch, and she's a very interesting philosopher, has a lot of helpful things to say, particularly I think for those of us who are in the theological tradition. But she has this in her collection of essays, The Sovereignty of Good. She has this great definition of what humility is. And she says that humility is not a peculiar habit of self-effacement, rather like having an inaudible voice. And I think that she's capturing what a lot of people think humility is. But she says that it is, and this is my emphasis, it is selfless respect for reality, and one of the most difficult and central of all the virtues. So selfless respect for reality. So what exactly is this reality that humility is a respect for? So there's another definition of humility, and this comes from an Australian monastic, Navard Kinsella, and he says that humility is nothing more or less than the attitude of the creature in the presence of his creator and the way of acting which results from such an attitude. So there we have two different definitions of humility. One, that humility is a selfless respect for reality. And the other is that humility is nothing more than we might say, the appropriate attitude of the creature in the presence of her creator and the way of acting that comes out of that. So what does this mean for us? How do we live into this reality? So I want to emphasize today, I think there are many ways that this can be played out, but I want to emphasize three truths that I think a respect for reality and a living into our being creatures in relationship to the creator call us to. And so the first is that we need to understand that we are creatures. I think that is an aspect of ourselves that we don't spend a lot of time reflecting on. And part of that is because we've inherited a tradition that increasingly separates us from the rest of the creation. We think of ourselves as a part, and we and this comes from many different places. I think its roots are very deep in the human person, but we weren't helped a lot by certain traditions in Enlightenment philosophy that really tried to separate out the body from the true center core of the human person. So you had people like René Descartes, who was a very important philosopher in the Enlightenment. And Descartes did some terrible things, like he defended vivisection, so like dissecting a live animal, because he said that the animal had no soul, and that the cries of the animal when it was being dissected were just the mechanical, like the responses of a machine, that it was just a mechanical response, that there was no feeling or real soul behind it. And along with Descartes, there are other thinkers like John Locke who saw the creation as this gift that had no intrinsic value. Locke believed that it was kind of this thing that could only be made valuable through human intention and work, but that there was no inherent value in creation. And so he said that was part of the way that he justified the colonialists taking land from the people who had lived on that land for thousands of years, many generations, because they weren't making good use of it, according to the English understanding of that. And I think both of those kinds of ideas, this denial that the center of ourselves has bodily form, and also that the creation as a whole is this kind of abstract gift that has no intrinsic value. Both of those are things that I think are at the roots of our ecological crisis. And even our prayer book, as wonderful as the Book of Common Prayer is, just notice how we talk about creation in the Book of Common Prayer. It's almost always referred to as a resource, and we're thankful for the resources of creation, but not this intrinsic valuing of creation. It's almost always in a use relationship. So that's the first fundamental truth we need to come to understand, is that we are creatures, that our lives are given, that we have a maker, and that we have limits. The second that's very much related to this is that we are dependent. Sorry, go back here. We depend upon the earth and the whole community of life. There's I'll get into this a little bit more, but as we've already noted, that just being a healthy human being means that we're already in relationship with all kinds of other creatures. If we were to be completely sterilized of all of that other life, that is living on and in our bodies, then we simply wouldn't be able to thrive as human beings. So what is it that, why we may wonder, were we created in this way? And I think it's because at the very base of our being is relationship and dependence and interdependence, but we weren't made to be these kind of free-floating autonomous selves. And part of that dependence is that we depend upon the life-giving breath of God's Spirit. Now, the Psalms, particularly Psalm 104 and other passages of Scripture, frequently talk about the breath of life being this God's own breath, and that we share that with other creatures. And that can be, I think, a really powerful understanding that life itself is continually sustained by this gift of God's breath, and that we are not only interdependent with the other material realities and creatures of the world, but also the reality of God. And then finally, the other truth that of the human person that I think we need to understand in order to embrace humility is that we are limited in our projects and our power, and that we are limited by our ignorance, and that we often don't know all that we need to know. T.S. Eliot in his four quartets has some wonderful reflections on humility, and in East Coker he says that the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility, because humility is endless. And before that, he's talking about he's in a very painful situation. The war is getting bad. It's World War II. He's looking for some source of hope, and he realizes that all of his ancestors have nothing to offer him other than to be human, and to recognize the powerlessness and limits that he must embrace, but that in that he can actually go back to the ground and find hope. So to say that we're limited in this way isn't a slight against the human person, and instead it's a call to be fully human. And when I think we live into that, we can find the empowerment that we need to live. So he says this means that we are mortal. We die. Our lives have a natural endpoint. That's part of our limitedness. All right, so I want to stop there and see if there are any questions at this point, and then I'll go on to some other digging into this a little bit more. But any questions or comments so far? Sorry, I'm not. Anyone? All right, well, we'll if no one has any questions, I can't see everyone, so you can just unmute yourself and speak up if you do want to offer something, but I'll just keep on going then. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again. So I think that I want to offer today 3 modes that can help us live into this reality of our creatureliness. So and these are drawn directly from those other truths that we need to. So first of all, embrace finitude, be dependent, and live with patience. So what does that mean exactly? So embrace finitude. So part of our problem is that we have lived beyond our limits. That people can talk about this in different ways. You can talk about that we've exceeded our carbon budget. We've exceeded the carrying capacity of the earth. But the central fact is that we have lived with too much, and we haven't embraced the limits that we can sustain in a sound and flourishing human life. And I have this book pictured here, The Story of More by Hope Jaron. Jaron is a climate scientist, and this is a really wonderful book. It's, how we got to climate change and where to go from here. But most of the first part of the book is this exploration of, from the time that she was born, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, to now, how much growth there has been in our economy, in our use of resources, in our use of electricity. There's been just this amazing explosion of more, of everything. And so she wants to tell that story of more. And she says, we can point to all of these different things, but fundamentally it's that more that is causing our ecological catastrophe. And she's speaking especially about climate change, but she really gets into more than climate change. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I think it's always important for us to, and there are some good writers who are pointing this out, but we need to think beyond just talking about the climate crisis or climate change, because we're really facing an ecological crisis across the board. And what happens sometimes is that if we just focus on that one problem and we get into, all we need to do is solve the carbon problem, then we put up windmills that hurt migrating birds, and we think we've done something good for the environment. I'm not against windmills, but they need to be placed and in ways that are responsible. And sometimes we just jump to this, this simple, okay, it's just a simple problem of carbon math, and we just need to create reduced emissions, but not look at it in the whole sense of the ecosystems of the earth and the way that our activities affect animals. So and the whole of creation. So that, I think that's so the answer to this problem with the story of more, Jaron said, is that we need to learn to live with less. And she says, do solar, do all of the things that people are recommending. But if you try to continue to live beyond one's means ecologically, then we're going to continue to have problems. So, if you have a house that requires a great deal of space and a great deal of heating and a great deal of hot water to go to, all of the multiple bathrooms and all of the, those sorts of things add up. And it doesn't matter if you put solar panels on your roof. That you're still costing more than the world needs. So we all need to learn to live in our finitude. Our machine world and culture covers this over for us. We don't sometimes even realize the ways in which we are not living into the reality of the world. And this is a truth that came home to me when I was started to ride my bike to work. So riding my bike to church, which I did this morning, is there's this hill that I never really noticed before, but it is a very long, hard hill. And it's kind of like the first thing I hit when I leave my neighborhood. I get onto this long hill that I have to struggle up, and I had not noticed it in a car because the car had hidden the energy output. I mean, the car had to work hard to get up it, of course, but all of that had been hidden from me. But by coming into a more direct relationship with the world, I had started to realize the ways that the kind of energy that was required. And so now even when I'm driving, I think about that energy. So I think that one of the ways that we can live into limits is to start to take responsibility for what Wendell calls our proxies. What are the things that we are handing over to other people or to machines to do for us that we could do for ourselves and take better responsibility through that? So for instance, the preparation of food. Many of us, when we buy food, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but we have no idea kind of what's involved in getting that food to us. And most of us cannot supply all of our food needs from our own home gardens. But by doing a little bit of gardening, even if it's just in a pot, we can start to learn about the proxies and the dependencies that we have. And by doing that, begin to recognize all of the limits that are also involved in those things. So I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about dependencies. So this is a picture of an eroded field. So there is a tremendous problem right now with the loss of topsoil, and topsoil is something that is fundamentally limited. It's not. It is a renewable resource, but it's a very slow renewal, and the rate at which topsoil is being lost. I mean, there's some various statistics thrown around like that. For every bushel of corn, Iowa loses 2 bushels of topsoil. Things like that, and the reality is the way that we are using the earth is depleting it, and it doesn't have to be that way, because like much of the topsoil loss is because of forms of agriculture that could be easily adjusted in ways, no-till, or a lot of this is being used to raise feed for livestock. And I won't go into like whether we should be a vegetarian or not. I'm not a vegetarian, but what matters more than being a vegetarian or not is how the animals that you eat have been raised. And if they've been raised on a well-managed pasture, then that's actually renewing the topsoil of the earth rather than depleting it. But we've got these systems all out of base. But part of that happens because we've gone beyond our limits. So one way of embracing limits is to begin to participate in the renewal of the earth, and a way to do that is composting. So I'm going to close today with a simple way into how to start composting. So before I get into this, I'll stop for a second and see if there are any. I'm going to just stop moment to moment, see if there are any questions or comments on anything so far. Anyone? Everyone with me? You can just give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right. Well, good. All right. Well, so to return to this, let me go back here. So it's part of living in limits is to, all of these limits dependence, they're all interlinked, but part of it is to recognize the cycles of renewal, and how much can be taken out of something before it begins to become depleted. And so it's important for us to recognize and understand the cycles of life. So this illustration comes from a group called Holistic Resource Management that do a lot of work with farmers who are interested in doing pasture-based agriculture. Alan Savory, he has a famous TED Talk, is the person who's started Holistic Resource Management. But you look at that, there can be this cycle of, with plants and animals and the soil, where carbon, to give one part of the whole ecological equation, is being cycled through this. And if it's all done at appropriate levels, if we live within the limits of the ecological life that we've been given, then all of this can just keep going. But when we start to live beyond those limits, then we start to lose that capacity. And this can play into other. I was having a conversation recently about financial markets. The endless pursuits of profit, particularly at the very high levels of profit that our world demands at the contemporary markets, it isn't ultimately sustainable without continuing to invent and ultimately extract more and more from the earth. And there's some interesting movements. There's a guy named Woody Tash who has started this whole movement called Slow Money, and he was an investment banker, ran some hedge funds, and was in charge of institutional investment for some large environmental foundations. And he started doing this work because he found that a lot of the environmental foundations, their funds were invested in things that were seeking very high returns, but not actually working in line with their mission. And so he started to think about, how can we move our money into ways that work in line with our mission? But he says that we need to think about profit in the same kind of way that ecological systems do. And ecological systems create profit at very slow rates, 5% or so. They're not, there's a lot of things are just being cycled through. There's not a lot of accumulation in ecological systems. I talked to a manager of a sustainable forest, and he said, I said, how much timber can you harvest in a year? And he said about 3%. In order to keep the forest cycles stable. So I think we need to think about taking less kind of profit out and living more within the sustainable cycles of the world. And that's part of living into our limits as well. All right, so be dependent. So I have a picture here on this slide of a leaf cutter ant. Has anyone ever seen leafcutter ants? If you've been to the tropics, or they're amazing. And I put this here because we are fundamentally and deeply dependent for our life upon little creatures like ants. We would not be able to live in flourishing as we do without all kinds of work being carried out by the insect world. And yet, how many of you think about insects? In your prayers of Thanksgiving, how often do you offer prayers for all of the insect life around you that makes your health and nourishment and all of that possible? And yet, insects are deeply responsible for all of this. I don't think it's a good equivalence, but that the entomologist E.O. Wilson says that if human beings were to disappear from the earth, that the ecosystems would be, for the most part, okay. But if ants were to disappear from the earth, there would be ecological collapse. Now, we can make some arguments against that, but I think that the fundamental truth that we need ants, and we are deeply dependent on these aspects of the natural world that we don't often pay attention to. So how do we start to practice dependence? So one way is to begin to recognize, going back to that limits thing, recognize the ways in which we are that if we depend upon the earth, then perhaps part of our work should be to work towards the renewal of our particular places, and not drawing away from our landscapes all of the things that are meant to sustain them. So as an example, leaves that are put to curbsides. I know some cities have this kind of operation. I got this slide actually from, I think this is from Arlington, but when this will be composted, the city will make it into new soil, and that's great. But leaves need to fall and nourish the soil around the tree, and there are ways that we should be collecting leaves and using that to help nourish the ground right where we are, and help remember those cycles. And that's a way for us to live more deeply into dependence. So compost your own leaves and use that leaf matter to then renew the ground in your own place. We can also think about all of the things that we think of as trash and begin to live into a different kind of economy. When we recognize how dependent we are, we start to live into a different relationship with the things around us, the economy around us. And so if you start composting, which is really a matter of the simple mixture of high carbon materials like leaves and high nitrogen materials like coffee grounds, then and if you mix those two together and just leave them, they will provide food for bacteria and fungi that will then break all of that material down into new humus soil. And so when you start to think in a kind of compost sort of way and recognize all of the dependencies that are part of that, you begin to enter into this new economy where what was once trash, coffee grounds being thrown out, leaves being put to the curb, starts to become this really important resource for your life. I mentioned this before, but one of the other ways that we learn dependence is, first of all, by I'm assuming that most of us here will not be able to supply most of our food needs by ourselves, but just by starting to shop at farmers markets. And so this farmers market is the market in Del Rey in Alexandria. That was the market that I would go to when I was in seminary in Alexandria. And one of the great things about going to a farmer's market like this, and hopefully that opportunity will start up again soon for many of us, but that you can begin to have relationships with the people that grow your food, and you can learn something about how they grow food. And maybe even you can come out to farm days and visits, and most farmers are welcome people to come out and see what they're doing. And through that, you can begin to recognize your dependencies, but also, as Wendell Berry said, begin to take some responsibility for the things that others are doing on your behalf, your proxies. And then also, even if you just have a little space for some pots, you can grow some food yourself. And that can be a really important way for appreciating the work of the farmers that are providing food for you, because as you'll learn, it's not easy. And so just growing a little bit can be a way to live into that mode of dependence. And then finally, there can be a kind of contemplative approach to dependence. And that comes with seeing ourselves to scale. I don't know if any of you, think are big hikers or anything, but when I was in the, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment, but when I was in the DC area, I love to go out to hike whenever possible, and especially like the more remote, like places like the Shenandoah Valley and or the national park there, and or Great Falls or other places like that. But when we go out into what Wendell Berry calls the given world, then we begin to recognize the scale of our life, that we are small, that we are in the midst of this vast creation. And there can be something really comforting about that. If you ever like been out to a place where there's lots of stars and just sort of looked up at the vast expanse of all of that, and it's not, you feel the smallness, but I don't know about you, but I always feel like that in that smallness there's also this kind of comfort that and it's the kind of comfort that God offers to Job in the book of Job when Job is wondering about all of his suffering. God basically says, "You're not the center of the world," and begins to show Job how God brings rain to the deserts where no human beings live, beyond the fulfillment of any human needs, and how God cares for the ravens, and how God cares for all of these wild animals that serve no human purpose. There's a very deliberate mapping of this is in Job 38 and following, but that smallness of scale, and I showed that image earlier because in a lot of Chinese art, this is actually a mode of contemplation of putting a very small human figure or a very small human structure in the midst of this vast mountain landscape, and I think that we need to do that, but we also need to preserve that possibility, because more and more of the world is being taken by human infrastructure. So we need places that where we can find that smallness. So I see a question here, real quick on the compost. And is it best to leave leaves where they fall, or collect them and spread them in the garden, or collect into a compost pile? That's a good question. And there, like many things, there are lots of theories out there. I think that you can more quickly develop the life of the soil in your place. Now we're not, always trying for quick fixes, but this is one place where we can take our understanding and accelerate a process to sort of answer a deficit that's been acquired over years. So when you make compost, the value of compost isn't in the material of the compost itself, but it's more like this medium for all of the life that is in that compost that then can go into the soil. And so when you are able to develop compost, then you can add that life back to the soil. So you're more likely, if you have an organized compost pile, to be able to really develop the life of the mycorrhizal fungi that help trees. Now, those mycorrhizal fungi will work naturally just under the tree itself, but and also I know that there's always this balance too of neighborhood expectations and whatnot. So one way to do that is just to rake up the leaves as you're expected to do, but then compost them, and then take that valuable compost and then place it back around the tree. But you can also just leave them. And it's amazing. I have one very large tree in my yard. I don't rake up the leaves from it. It's in our backyard, and those leaves disappear very quickly. But I do pick up other people's leaves from their curbsides. Stay away from Norway maple. It's an invasive maple species that can actually harm. It has toxins in it that can harm a lot of plants. So I'll give that caution. But so I don't know how to identify a Norway maple, so I just avoid people who have maples in their yard. They're actually pretty similar to a native maple here. So but that's just one little tip. Any more questions while? on here. All right. So let me share here again. All right. So the final sort of practice that I would or mode that I would call you into is practicing patience. Now, one of the problems I think that we faced in moving into this time of ecological crisis is that most crises don't call for a response of patience, and we don't and there's some very good reasons to think urgently, and I'm not at all calling for what might be called a quietism or like let's just be patient and it's all going to work itself out. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But I do think that we also need to be able to have the kind of measured life that allows us to kind of step back and look at the big picture rather than the kind that's literally running around and putting out fires. So to guide us in this, this picture is of the humus that develops on a forest floor, and it's a very, very slow process that provides food for all kinds of life as it goes. So Wendell Berry has this wonderful poem called "Liberation, the Mad Farmer," or it's called "Liberation," or Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. Sorry, getting tongue-tied there, but Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. So it's available online if you want to look up the whole poem. It's wonderful. But one of the lines in it is, he says, "Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years." That's the natural process. That's how natural wealth is developed, is this very slow accrual. And so what would it mean for us to think about aligning our economics to humus rather than the rapid rise in industrial production or those sorts of things, and that's the kind of thinking that Wendell Berry is calling us towards. So this stance of kind of stepping back and being patient, I'm guided very much in this by some really provocative thinking from this British writer Paul Kingsnorth, and I think he has some really exciting writing to come soon. But he wrote this book called "Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist," and what he means by recovering is that he loves the given world, the creation, and he found that more and more what he thought was being called environmentalism was really this defense of trying to sustain industrial civilization, which for him is the source of the very crisis. But he, in exploring, like, so what do you do when you want to take this different approach? He found that one of the important things is to kind of take this patient, contemplative stance. And at the beginning of one of his essays, he has this epigram from Ian Hamilton Finlay, where he said that certain gardens are described as a retreat when they are really attacks. And I think this is helpful to answer we're not trying, in calling for patience and thinking about, maybe instead of spending all of your time marching in the streets, some of your time should be dedicated to developing a incredible diversity of life in your own yard. That those things aren't in conflict with one another. but oftentimes the emphasis is put on the activism, but not in this kind of cultivation within a home, that I think can actually inform and draw us into new ways of insight with the more activist sides. And Ian Hamilton Finlay was involved in a lot of social activism, but he eventually kind of withdrew to this country house and developed these wonderful gardens. But what he wanted to explain was that in doing this, he wasn't giving up his call for justice and his work. What he was really doing was finding the space and being patient so that he could call that forth in a deeper and more profound way. And I think that there's need for that. So that's part of what patience means here. And then finally, this is something deep in our Christian tradition. This call for patience. Christians were people who, in the very early years of the faith, suffered all kinds of persecution. And what is the common word that comes back to them? Both, if we look at the letters of Paul or some of the other New Testament writers, if you look at the book of Revelation, the word that comes back to them is endure. That the goal isn't, it's kind of to outweight the empire, and not so much to outwit it, but to just to wait and to know that that in that waiting we are doing something important. So there's this great book by Alan Kreider, who's a church historian, called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And he emphasizes how he looks at the writings of a lot of the early Christians, and they had this very unusual emphasis on patience. They talked about patience a lot more than we talk about it now. And he subtitles it the Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And he has this great quote from Justin Martyr, who was one of their first Christian apologists and people to kind of articulate the Christian faith for people outside of it. And Justin Martyr says that one of the ways that Christians will win over their pagan neighbors is through their strange patience. And I think that strange patience, I think that's a great call. And I think what he means by that is that to be patient in that world was unusual, but think about being patient even in our world, how unusual that is. And yet so much of the crisis that we face comes from a lot of rushing and moving about quickly and doing things, wanting things now and not waiting. And so I think that we need to renew this Christian tradition of patience. And it's a really important part of fully living into a life of humility. So, there are even some books on patience and humility together. They're very, very closely linked. So I want to take some questions, and I see this great recommendation about the compost crew that will take your stuff and compost it into a high quality compost. For Little Rock people, there's a similar service I'll put in the chat. I don't know the website, but it's called the Urban Food Loop, where they will pick up your garden scraps and things and make some really high quality compost with it. But for those of you who would like to maybe learn a little composting, there are all kinds of resources online, but I would encourage you, the very simplest way is just to get a pile of leaves or a pile of wood chips, wood mulch that you can usually get from tree cutting service or someplace like that, and just make a small pile and just have a an ice cream bucket, one of those plastic ice cream buckets, keep it in your freezer, put all of your materials from your kitchen cuttings, your coffee grounds, anything that's not an animal product or oils, any vegetable material can go in there. And the reason mostly for the animal products and the oils is not so much because they can't be composted, it's because they tend to attract pests that you don't want. And what you do is you dig into that pile in one spot, and you start at the base, and you dig in about 6 inches to a foot deep, and you deposit that material after it's thawed out from the freezer. And the reason you can putting it in the freezer helps is because it just keeps the smells down. And it's, so you thaw that out because the microbes don't like super cold temperatures. So you get it to room temperature. You put it into that pile, and then you cover it over. And then the next time you have you're ready to deposit again, you just move around the base. You kind of move in a spiral all the way to the top, where you're depositing little bits here and there, all apart from one another. And you but you don't want to turn it or anything. You want to keep it stable because that actually gives more room for for particularly the fungus, the mycorrhizal fungi that go in there for them to develop, because every time you turn the compost pile, it breaks all their fungal hyphae apart. So that is the simplest, easiest way for most people. And if you're a person without a yard, I encourage you to look at the many resources on worm composting, because that can also be a really great way to do composting if you're like in an apartment or just have a small patio area. Worm composting can be a really, really helpful thing. So there are lots of resources out there. The internet's a great gift in that regard. So, but I'll maybe see if there are a couple of questions I can answer before we need to go. Harriet, yes. If you can.
I've composted for years, and then I stopped mowing, and that sort of made me stop. But I want to, I hired someone, but I want to get back to it. I'll figure out exactly where I'll get the grass clippings from. But I always thought you were supposed to turn it. I always religiously turned every time I added sort of kitchen scrappings and all, I always turned it. And that's not good, you're saying?
So, so there's a kind of a variety of goods that are competing in the turning question. So there's a very hands-on type of composting that's called thermophilic composting, and you have a very specific mix, and you kind of mix it all together at once, where you've got 4 buckets of carbon material and 2 buckets of nitrogen material, and you mix it all at once, and you water it to this very specific consistency, and then you watch the temperatures go up to 130 degrees, and that's a very active composting process, and that makes really good biologically rich compost. But with this method is called a static pile method, and the importance of turning is that what you're wanting the really helpful microbes are aerobic microbes. They need air. And what you're doing by turning is you're helping get some air in there. Mm-hmm. So one thing to add to that would just be to say, occasionally you can put chimneys in and kind of put some air, take a shovel or something and use the handle and just poke holes throughout. And once the compost is sort of mostly finished, and once that kind of pile is finished, you can occasionally start to turn it. But there's this balance of the mycorrhizal fungi that, and also worms will really, if it's in a yard and it's on the soil, then the worms hopefully, and you can add even worms to it, but they will do their work in it, and they're kind of turning it internally and creating passageways and air holes and things. But it can be it can be difficult to there are debates about, like many things in the world, they're debates.
Okay.
I see another question. I think maybe one more before.
Michael, yeah.
Hi. We may not have a lot of time to answer this, Ragan, but I just, I love it. I think sometimes it can feel overwhelming and highly individualistic to think about how do I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so how am I going to grow my own food and transform my yard and do all these things? And it can feel really overwhelming because what I really long for and think is a part of the slow equation of all of this is doing things in a community. And I just wonder what your maybe vision or what part that plays in even just pressing against the culture that we have of such individualism, and imagining even as a church or as a community of like-minded people, like how do you band together in a way so that this is possible? It feels like more possible and even more enjoyable, maybe, because we're doing it together. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, I'll give a quick answer to that, and maybe point you to some places that could provide some further answers. One, I think, there's been a movement to develop community gardens, and actually the Episcopal Church right now has this Good News Gardens program that they're really encouraging churches to develop gardens. Now, the one of the great values of a community garden is that people can learn from one another and in how to grow, how to have, make compost, all of those sorts of things. And then the other is that there was an old movement, a rural movement called the Grange movement, where communities would share farm equipment and share resources. And that is something I think that needs to be renewed for a different kind of time. And I think that churches could be great centers for that. We don't all need to have all the equipment. Like there's a tool called a broadfork that's very good for developing soil. Most people need it one time a year, and it costs like $300 or $500, even if you get a really good one. Well, we don't all need to have one, but maybe one could be at the church and people could just lease it out and bring it back, and the church could start to serve in that kind of Grange capacity, and people could cooperate more and learn from one another. There's also skill exchanges that are becoming more and more popular, where people trade skills, and someone knows how to do can really well and they share that skill, and someone else knows how to compost really well, and I think churches can also be really great places for that kind of work. But there's a wonderful book called The Permaculture City by Toby Hemingway, and that I think gives some good ideas on how to think about these kind of social aspects. So I saw a question, and there's I'm not going to be able to get any farther in answering questions, but I will send Joshua a list of, as best as I can remember, the books that I've referenced, and maybe some other further resources that I haven't mentioned, and I'll make sure that Christchurch get that as well. So if you're interested in following up on any of this, but it's been so great to be with all of you these last 3 weeks.
Yes, Ragan, thank you so much for this immensely thoughtful and provocative workshops. I'm so glad that they'll live on YouTube for me to be able to return to and for the future of our communities thinking about being responsible creatures. Thank you, Ragan. Chris Moore is going to close us in prayer.
Thank you. Creator God, we thank you for our beautiful planet in its glory, its complexity, and its simplicity. Grant that we may be a Dhamma, good soil, in our church, our community, and our world. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Christchurch, Little Rock, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you all soon.
Take care.